For your next assessment, which will be summatively assessed, but mainly is going to act as a formative preparation for the individual oral that you're going to be doing at the end of this year. You're going to prepare a video essay that fulfills the same requirements as the individual oral. So, key goals of the individual oral: examine the ways in which the global issue of your choice is presented through the content and form of one of the works, meaning a literary text, and one of the texts, meaning a language text that you've studied. And obviously, all of the texts that we've studied, you can see there in the unit section. Black Mirror being a language text, Tweeter in Chief, that we're going to dig more into, Trump's tweets being a language text, Ideology, Zizek's Pervert's Guide to Ideology being a language text, Szymborska being one of the literary works, the anti-psychiatry materials body of work that we've looked at, Phil Borges' film together with the Adult Swim constituting a body of work looking at the anti-psychiatry movement, Brave New World being one of our literary works, and the Newsroom being a language text. These latter two, Brave New World as the literary work and the Newsroom, are the two that I'm going to model for you today as a video essay that fulfills, hopefully, the assessment criteria of the individual oral. So, going to explore a global issue, and hopefully, in terms of knowledge, understanding and interpretation, analysis and evaluation, focus and organisation and language, and we'll look at the assessment rubric in more detail afterwards. This will address the required elements of the individual oral. Determining the global issue, you've got some guidance here, but remember, as we discussed when we did your presentations at the beginning of the year, these lines of inquiry or fields of inquiry are just there for guidance. You don't prescriptively need to either identify your global issue as derived from one of these fields of inquiry or make any reference to these fields of inquiry. They're just there as kind of one model of a way in to determining a global issue that you're going to investigate in your two texts. Okay? Any questions about that? Cool, no worries. At this stage, we'll discuss it more afterwards. So without further ado, we'll get into my attempt at delivering a video essay. What I've done is I've built a presentation within which I've embedded excerpts from the literary work and the language text. So there's excerpts from the Newsroom, clips, stills from the Newsroom, and quotes from the literary work from Brave New World. So let's get started. So this video essay is going to explore the global issue of conformity to the political status quo versus honest self-expression and personal integrity. And it's going to look at this through the two texts, or rather the text, the language text of the Newsroom, the HBO show, and the literary work, Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. So, in considering this global issue, conformity to the political status quo versus honest self-expression and personal integrity, let's start off by looking in a little bit more detail at one of these two texts. So, we'll be looking at The opening 40 lines of Brave New World, as per the demands of the task, an extract of no more than 40 lines or the audio-visual equivalent, and the opening scene of Season 1, Episode 1 of The Newsroom. Some of the concepts that will be very relevant in considering this are certainly the aspects of personal identity, different perspectives, and culture. With Brave New World, written in 1931 and published in 1932, Huxley produced a highly, one might argue, prophetic vision of the manner in which we're moving, and certainly since the 1930s, our culture, our global culture, and certainly the British culture from which he was writing, has moved in a more technocratic and consumerist direction. The novel itself, we could broadly define within the sci-fi dystopia genre, although it will be my argument here that particularly if we consider the issue of conformity to the political status quo versus honest self-expression and personal integrity, Huxley moves far beyond any kind of a reductive adherence to the genre tropes of sci-fi. In considering the opening 40 lines of Brave New World, the following authorial choices and the manner in which they convey the technocratic status quo of the world state will be considered. The use of mechanistic and conformist diction, the pronounced use of irony, and together these dimensions will be shown to constitute a powerful form of satire. Satire, of course, being a mode of here literature that uses humour to draw attention to the flaws in here a political hegemony. And another dimension that is produced by this use of mechanistic and conformist diction and irony is the juxtaposition of this incredibly mechanistic world with our tragic hero and his very poetic and humanistic prose, that of course being John the Savage. To reframe it in terms of our broader global issue, the status quo of this technocratic world state is thus contrasted with what we later in the novel see to be the honest self-expression and the romantic aspiration for personal integrity of our tragic hero, John the Savage. A squat grey building of only 34 stories. Over the main entrance the words Central London Hatchery and Conditioning Centre, and in a shield the world state's motto, community, identity, stability. The capitalisation here is quoted directly from the text. Here, Huxley emphasises the manner in which these proper nouns of the Central London Hatchery and Conditioning Centre have this almost monolithic status. They are more than simply words, more than simply buildings. They indeed are entities. We might even go further to reference the theory that was so popular at the time of Marx of reification. These words convey things, institutional objects that have come to have more power, significance, and autonomy than the human beings themselves. The world state's motto, community, identity, and stability, emphasizing this totalitarian nature of the political status quo. That again will later be contrasted with our tragic hero's attempt at honest self-expression and personal integrity. The enormous room on the ground floor faced towards the north, cold for all the summer beyond the panes, for all the tropical heat of the room itself, a harsh thin light glared. If we look at the rest of this extract, the underlining and embolding having been added by me here indicates the predominance of a diction that is distinctively cold and has distinct connotations of death. Wintriness responds to wintriness, academic goose flesh, pale corpse-coloured rubber, a frozen, dead, ghost-like light. So we've got this very pronounced lexical field that builds up this imagery of death and of non-living quality, followed then by the pronounced irony of the director's statement. And this, said the director opening the door, is the fertilizing room. Fertilizing room, of course, being, in terms of direct denotation, a room that produces life. And yet the preceding paragraph, as we have seen, by use of Huxley's pronouncedly death-oriented diction, is highly ironic. If we continue through this extract, as the director of Hatcheries and Conditioning soliloquizes or lectures the students, although the diction of soliloquizing is not coincidental, a soliloquy not being the same as a monologue, but being a expression of singular thought that's not an act of communication. The audience desperately scribble. Their writing down of the notes straight from the horse's mouth are a rare privilege. Their noting of this is just for, and again I quote, of course, some sort of general idea, which they must have if they were to do their work intelligently, though as little of one, if they were to be good and happy members of society, as possible. For particulars, as everyone knows, make for virtue and happiness. Generalities are intellectually necessary evils. Again, this satirical excerpt where the students blindly note down the speech of the director emphasizes the manner in which conformity to the status quo and adherence to the orthodoxy, rather than any degree of genuine critical engagement with what they are listening to, or indeed honest self-expression and any sense of personal integrity, is far more important. This is another example of the manner in which Huxley's use of satirical idiom really emphasizes this global issue that conformity to the status quo here in the world state is much more important than honest self-expression and personal integrity. Of course, later in the novel, beyond the 40-line excerpt under which we are that is under consideration today, we meet John the Savage, who, to quote, once God, once poetry, once real danger, once freedom, once goodness, once sin. Just the fluidity of these lines, and indeed the preponderance or the anaphora of the repetition of the I, is indicative of quite how much more concerned with honest self-expression and personal integrity that is much more recognizable to Huxley's contemporary audience in the 1930s, or indeed ourselves in this perhaps highly prescient and prophetic novel, would find to be humane. So, the opening 40 lines of Brave New World pronouncedly convey a world state in which the mechanistic and conformist diction and irony produces a satire that demonstrates that conformity to the political status quo is the absolute, with honest self-expression and personal integrity really being a very faint and distant, even alien consideration at the beginning of this novel. We experience the world state, therefore, as alien, inhumanely conformist, and later, when we meet him, I would argue, we thus deeply sympathise with John the Savage. His more humane prose style and underlying characteristic is far more recognisable to certainly Huxley's contemporary audience, but indeed, I'd argue, also to our 21st century sensibilities. So, if we move on to consider the Newsroom. This text was created and written by Aaron Sorkin. It's a free series which ran from 2012 to 2014, extensively researched and based around real-world contemporary news events, and, I would argue, highly partisan and disingenuous. It basically makes a very strong case for the democratic centrist line of politics, leaning indeed towards more left-wing liberal democratic political position. Disingenuous by virtue of its incredibly clever use of a central protagonist, the news anchor, who is nominally a Republican, though so centrist and libertarian leaning in his sensibilities as to effectively be a Democrat. The following authorial choices deconstruct the Punch and Judy show, or the, Democrats versus Republicans partisan nature of US politics. The use of intertextuality and postmodern audience play, cinematography and editing, which again, like as we have just seen with Brave New World, these two authorial choices combine to produce satire and, again, a very sympathetic positioning towards our conflicted hero. The anchor here is less tragically conflicted than John the Savage proves to be, but likewise a conflicted hero towards whom we find ourselves occupying a very sympathetic position. 2012 was a turning point in news media and US politics. It was arguably the death of long-form narrative, with the latter ascendance of the tweeter-in-chief to the most perhaps powerful position in the world, and arguably the death of true and well-funded investigative journalism as populist social media came to occupy such a large space in global and certainly US culture. Within this text, there are several layers of audience intertextual complexity. As this screenshot shows, we have the student posing the question to the panel of experts being interviewed on a television show which we see projected behind them. This positions us as an audience in a very interesting place where we're negotiating between several layers of production and reception of news text. In this opening scene, our conflicted hero, the news anchor, is disengaged, while again the left and right, the Punch and Judy show of the Democrat and the Republican pundits, argue with one another. The soft focus lighting, which often zooms in on him, fading out the others, uses the cinematography to make him highly relatable, and indeed the sound editing, where their voices are often blurred and only faintly decipherable, just hearing sound bites of stereotypical left versus right political rhetoric, amplify this manner in which we find ourselves occupying a highly sympathetic position towards Will McAvoy, the anchor. If we consider the opening scene then and look at the way in which this plays out, you hear in the background the manner in which the host comments over this Punch and Judy show between the left and the right, and we occupy this position that we see Will McAvoy embodying, of finding this bandying of rhetoric from left to right relatively meaningless. The camera literally positions us between the two of them, and then the rapid intercutting from left to right further amplifies, again, this Punch and Judy show type meaninglessness to the nature of contemporary American political discourse. So, to conclude, satire is the mode through which both of these texts, or this literary work and this text, position us with great sympathy towards the conflicted hero who's reaching for something like honest self-expression and personal integrity in a world, be that a fictional extrapolation into the 21st century, well, 23rd century from the 1930s, or indeed Aaron Sorkin's contemporary reality, in which we, like those heroes, hunger for an honest self-expression and the possibility of personal integrity in a world that abjectly denies it. Thank you. Cool. Okay. All right, so I got a bit of a sore throat. I'm a bit tired, and obviously I've got a lot of experience in doing this kind of thing. But that PowerPoint only took me a few hours to assemble. And if you've got your content on there, and the content was roughly equivalent to about 10 bullet points, the prose content was roughly equivalent to about 10 bullet points, in addition to the 40 lines of text that you're allowed to bring in, and the equivalent in audio-visual terms, which means a number of stills, and if you want to play a short excerpt, that would also be fine for your purposes. It really is a great opportunity to, one, get to know the video essay medium and work with it, but also to prepare for your individual oral presentation. I didn't time myself. Be interesting to see if I...
17 minutes.
Okay, so, yeah, well over the prescribed 10 minutes. You guys are going to stick to 10 minutes. To be fair, many of you are far less waffly, far more concise than I am, all right? Any questions while it's fresh?
What's the time limit on the video that you're on the show?
So, as in the excerpt that you use?
Yeah, the video one.
Okay, so it's deemed to be equivalent to 40 lines, right? Which means that there isn't any strict pronouncements issued by the IB on this. But if you have an opening excerpt like that one from the Newsroom that's 3 or 4 minutes long, I'd consider that reasonable. Yeah. So in the absence of a precise ruling from the IB on this, it's left at the teacher's discretion, and I'd say a 3 to 4 minute extract like that would be reasonable. Any other questions? Yes, Alex.
In the actual I/O, would we be allowed anything besides from the excerpt we have chosen?
So in the actual I/O, you're allowed the 40 lines or less from your literary work, and the equivalent, which, as we've just Ritzy have just discussed, is slightly ambiguous. The equivalent in audio, visual, or other text type forms. So that would probably be a number of screenshots and or a short excerpt of video. In the recording, for your actual I/O, you wouldn't want to play any video. You wouldn't want to hear anything other than your voice. But if you wanted to play an extract with the volume muted, because it allows you, as it did in my video essay, to comment on the dynamics of the editing and the cinematography, if let's say you've chosen an AV text, that would be cool. So within those broad guidelines, you just approach me with what you think is your prescribed 40-line equivalent for each of the texts, and I'll tell you whether it's okay. In addition to those two extracts, the 40 lines, and the equivalent from a language text, you're allowed 10 bullet points. Notes in only 10 bullet points. But if you review my PowerPoint slides, it's not much more than 10 bullet points. Because, of course, what you see there is just from the 40-line extract. What you see there is just from the 40-line extract. So I've got this, and you notice what I did for the video essay, right? I had my global issue on every slide. Do you know why I did that? And a prompt to me. My advice to you also is when you do your TOK presentation, have your knowledge questions on the slides like that. Prompt to you. It's kind of like your topic sentence or reference back to your thesis in an essay. Give yourself a prompt so it's visually right there in front of you. Yeah? And yes, for the video essay form, it helps the audience. So if we review the slides, you'll see, okay, this is one bullet point. You'll see it over and over again. Conformity to political status quo versus honest self-expression and personal integrity. You could consider that one bullet point. Someone keep count. So that's 2 so far. You could consider that a third bullet point, describing what extracts you're using. Although, to be honest, that can be comprised within your 40 lines, so you don't even need that. So we're still on 2 bullet points. Details about Brave New World and a couple of concepts that you're relating it to. That would be third bullet point. The kind of thesis statement regarding Brave New World. Is that 4th or 5th bullet point? 4th, right? Again, this is just an excerpt from, so that doesn't constitute a bullet point. Again, just an excerpt, and you can, of course, you can reference those excerpts. That doesn't constitute your bullet point. This is an extract from beyond the 40 lines. You want to discuss the work, the extract, in relation to the broader body of work, i.e. in relation to the rest of the novel. Your study primarily centers on the extract that you've chosen, but you want to put it in the context of the novel. So this quote from John the Savage is effectively like my, I think it's 5th bullet point, that just allows me to relate the 40 lines that I have focused on to the broader context of the novel. John's later narrative being where we see the honest self-expression and personal integrity that contrasts with the technocratic world state. So that's our 5th bullet point. 6th bullet point, kind of thesis statement, summarized, or rather concluding sentiment summarized as we frame it in relation to that quote from John the Savage that puts it in the broader context of the novel. So is that 5th or 6th bullet point? 6th? Okay. 7th bullet point, telling us about the newsroom. 8th bullet point, thesis statement about the newsroom. These two might be a 9th bullet point, just context and content of the extracting question. 10th bullet point, how we're positioned towards the anchor, Will McAvoy, in this excerpt. And then in my conclusion, I just referenced back to the two thesis statements for the text and the work, so that doesn't take us beyond 10 bullet points. Simple. All right, so for your video essay, you're going to fulfill the same parameters, okay? You can do whatever you like, my gut. You can make it however you like. You're not going to have to perform it live. I just did that for you so you can see how it operates, and because it's more efficient for me to do it that way. But you can construct it minute by minute, do little recordings if you want. My advice is use PowerPoint. You can embed videos. You can, when you click on the video, you just go to playback and you select it to play automatically. When you click on the slide, that slide comes on, it will start playing automatically. You can put your quotes in, you talk over them. So my advice is just do exactly what I've done. Use, as you saw here, I used QuickTime, which is loaded on all of your Macs. You select screen recording, make sure that the audio is set up, because sometimes it defaults to not having the microphone on, and just set up a PowerPoint and talk through it. You will be assessed on these summatively using the assessment criteria for the IO. Any final questions? Cool and the gang. Okay.